audience arrives and is admitted. We usually wait until we get to about 200 or so participants, which has not seemed to be a problem. So thank you for your patience. It should just take a few more seconds, in fact, the way that the seats are filling up. All right. We are close enough on to 200 or so in our audience, and let's begin. Good afternoon, one and all, attending from both near and far, attending this Monday, November 2nd, 2020 edition of the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design's Public Lecture Series. My name is Peter McKeith. I'm the Dean of the school. It's my privilege to welcome all of you to our virtual auditorium. And in fact, for this afternoon, I'm sitting in our actual auditorium, Schollmeyer Hall, to perhaps give a greater sense of reality to the proceedings altogether. In just a moment or two, we will have further welcomes and introductions. But as we get started, I want to make sure that all of us comprehend the gravity of the day that is upon us, beginning tomorrow morning, which is to say tomorrow, November 3rd, is Election Day, in which your vote matters, every vote matters, and together with our Chancellor and our Provost, I here and now encourage everyone to take advantage of the enfranchisement that has been granted to us all and exercise your right as a citizen. Also, I would like to begin this lecture, as we now do all of our public events at the school, with what is right and proper to do, that is our land acknowledgement statement. The indigenous history of the land the University of Arkansas sits on goes back to time immemorial. And across that expanse of time, many successive groups have lived here and created sacred legacies in this area. The Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design acknowledges indigenous peoples were forced to leave their ancestral lands, including the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations with ties to Northwest Arkansas. We further recognize that a portion of the Trail of Tears runs through our campus, and that the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee or Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations passed through what is now Arkansas during this forced removal. We acknowledge all indigenous teachers, researchers, and all other residents in our community and region today. We seek continuity and connection to the past as we look to the future with increased collaboration with indigenous governments and entities. We say to the citizens of indigenous nations, we see you and we thank you. Now, we start this lecture series as well with further acknowledgements. In the first place, our lecture series is produced in collaboration with the University of Arkansas's Office for Diversity and Inclusion. And more nationally, or even internationally, it is produced in collaboration with Places Journal, a journal of architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism, of which the school is proud to be a partner, and for whom we thank editors Nancy Levinson and Deborah Lilly in particular. And as well, this lecture series always benefits from local benefactors. And in the case of this fall's lecture series, we benefit very much from the generosity of Ken and Liz Allen of Fayetteville, Arkansas, and their support of the school's efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, with that said, I'd like to welcome a special guest before our lecturer, and that is the Provost of the University of Arkansas, Charles Robinson. Provost Robinson, could you join us? And we look forward to your words of welcome to Ms. Wilkinson and our audience.
Thank you, Dean McKeith. And it is indeed a pleasure to welcome Michelle Wilkinson on behalf of the University of Arkansas and our Chancellor, Joseph Steinmetz. We're excited to have her presentation and this program for our campus community. It is important for our broadening our understanding and also increasing our connection with American history and also with our understanding of design. And so I'm very thrilled to welcome Professor Wilkinson and also each and every one of you and your participation in this important program, and look forward to hearing from her and what she has to offer to us as a campus community. Again, thank you, Dean McKeith, for your leadership in this regard, and I'm excited about this opportunity for our campus.
Thank you, Provost Robinson, and I know you speak as much as a professor of history as you do as our academic leader.
Yes.
To take us further into this evening's program, I'd like to welcome Brian Holland, Assistant Professor of Architecture and the lecture series coordinator, for further words of introduction, as well as an overview on the lecture series more generally. Brian, please.
Thank you, Dean McKeith. And thanks to all of you for joining us online today. As Dean McKeith said, my name is Brian Holland and I coordinate the school's public lecture series here. This series has been guided by a desire to deepen our exploration of the following questions. What role can designers and architects play in addressing the many challenges we're facing today? How is public life and public space changing as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolds? How can we as design students, educators, and professionals best utilize the training and tools of our disciplines to build a healthier, more equitable and just world? And in a time of great collective urgency, what projects, histories, and ideas can help us better understand how design has helped shape the spaces and structures we've inherited? And how can we learn from past mistakes while strengthening our commitment to the design of a better future? Against that backdrop, I'm very delighted to be able to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Michelle Joan Wilkinson. I will provide a fuller introduction to her lecture in just a moment, but first I want to briefly mention that next Monday, November 9th, will be our final lecture for this fall series. We will be hosting Irene Chang, who is an associate professor and architectural historian at the California College of the Arts and the co-editor of the recently released book, Race and Modern Architecture, A Critical History from the Enlightenment to the Present. In her lecture titled Notes Toward an Anti-Racist Architectural History, Chang will focus on the possibility of an anti-racist pedagogy in design education, following conversations initiated this summer in design schools around the country. I do hope we will see you again next week for this final lecture. Let me briefly turn it over to Byron McEwen, our Special Events Manager and Public Programs Coordinator here at the school, for a few quick words. Byron?
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our lecture today. Just a quick reminder, please utilize the Q&A feature. You can find it located at the bottom of your screen with a little Q&A tab. Please submit your questions there. It helps us keep track of them in a much more orderly fashion than posting them to the chat. The chat sometimes can get active and can be lost, especially if you don't send it to the panelists or to everyone on the panel. As far as the continuing ed credits, if that applies to you, this does not apply to students. So please, students, do not submit your student ID number. There's no credit there per se. We only offer credits for those in AIA and ASLA, no others. Unfortunately, that's something we've been seeing on the back end, as well as the recordings will be published eventually, but as of the moment, they're only for students and faculty with access via the UARC account. So keep your eyes out for a future news release about when they'll be public. Back to you, Brian.
Thank you, Byron. So one final note to say that today's post-lecture Q&A will be moderated by Ngazi Brown, who is a lecturer here in the Department of Architecture, along with Alex Cooper, who is a third-year architecture student here. And Now, so we'll look forward to seeing you at the end. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Michelle Joan Wilkinson. Michelle Joan Wilkinson is a curator at the Smithsonian Institution National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., where she is expanding the museum's collections in architecture and design. Wilkinson co-curated 2 inaugural museum exhibitions, A Century in the Making, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond. In 2018, she served as lead organizer for the museum's 3-day symposium, Shifting the Landscape, Black Architects and Planners, 1968 to Now. Before arriving at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Wilkinson spent 6 years as Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture. She has also worked at the National Gallery of Art, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. As a fellow of the Center for Curatorial Leadership in 2012, Wilkinson completed a short-term residency at the Design Museum in London. Her research on architectural heritage in the Anglophone Caribbean has been presented to international audiences in Suriname, England, India, and the United States. Wilkinson's most recent efforts explore issues of representation in architectural renderings. Wilkinson received a Bachelor of Arts from Bryn Mawr College and a PhD from Emory University. In 2019 to 2020, she was a Loeb Fellow in Residence at Harvard Graduate School of Design. So without further ado, I give the Zoom podium over to Michelle Joan Wilkinson.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay, I am going to share my screen. Let's see. And I'm toggling back and forth a bit between one screen here and another screen. So if I look away, you know that I'm reading on here and looking at you guys on this one. So my lecture is titled Black Pillars, Notes on Precarious Resilience. And it is dedicated to Doreen Wilkinson, my aunt, 1933 to 2020. I want to thank her for everything that she was to me and my family. So notes on precarious resilience. What if we weren't resilient? What if we aren't resilient? And then the second epigraph. You're free, they keep telling us. But she would have been alive if she hadn't acted so free. That's from Jesse Williams, a speech that he gave to the BET Awards in 2016. So I've said my good afternoons and thank yous. And today is a kind of crazy day for all of us, right? There's so much on our minds and there's so much that we are carrying. So I'm asking you, what are you holding up? Who are you supporting? What is your heavy lift? An invocation. Race woman, Black community, a sort of mythic, imposing collective that stands for something. I want to talk about architecture and race. And by race, I mean Black people. Not Black people like individuals with social security numbers, IDs, and rents. Black people as in the socially constructed, racialized entity that operates and activates terms like the Black community, Black America, the Black population. That mythic abstraction of a potent collective that stands for something. What does this assumed collective have to do with the idea of architecture today? What even is architecture today without the social constructions of race and the determinations of value based on such? America is a malleable figure. It can be drawn like Lady Liberty. It can be drawn like a big house, or a cabin for the enslaved, or a skyscraper, or a double-wide shotgun. It can be drawn like turquoise shapes, each new contour, another dimension of the American story. I wanted to talk about race, but I meant Black people who stand for something, like they used to say, a race woman, a race man. These folks were pillars. There is a drawing here, pillars, architectural. They stood up, they were pillars and bridges and the foundation. Thought leaders, provocateurs, activists, unwavering, uncompromising, and adamant, unmoved by the distraction of their day to give in. End of invocation. Can you still see my screen? Okay, great. So as the title of my talk suggests, I have some thoughts about the notion of resilience. It's a common word, but one which is prevalent in two fields that define my current work: architecture and design, and African-American history and culture. As a curator at the National Museum devoted to African-American history and culture, I can tell you that the word resilience appears throughout our promotional materials. It is in our press packet to describe the conceptual design elements of the museum. Quote, as the outer layer of the building, the corona draws on imagery from both African-American and American history. Well, from both African and American history, reaching toward the sky in an expression of faith, hope, and resiliency. Resilience is a key focus in the exhibition titled Making a Way Out of No Way. And the slide you're looking at actually shows you some of the design elements that inspired the museum. In Making a Way Out of No Way, we say that exhibition reflects the perseverance, resourcefulness, and resilience required of African Americans not only to survive, but to thrive in America. Despite tremendous obstacles, prior to opening, the museum expressed that African Americans have exemplified a, quote, resilient spirit that is also fundamentally American. In those early days, the positioning of resilience was within the American grain. It was discussed as a shared American value that became a defining element of the African American experience. Resilience is used in the many speeches and presentations we curators give to describe that enduring spirit, that culture of perseverance, that unshakable faith and indomitable hope of the African American. I have used it in my own writings, but I've also questioned it. What if we weren't resilient? My current focus as a curator is to expand the museum's collection in the areas of architecture and design. This includes collecting archives of Black architects, creating digital collections of architectural drawings, collecting works of graphic design and other forms of illustration, as well as seeking out other forms of design. For the architecture-related collecting, I work to expand my base of contacts by attending conferences like the National Organization of Minority Architects, Black in Design, and smaller gatherings of practitioners and scholars. Most recently, I was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where I was able to sit in on courses covering architectural history, architectural representation, urban planning, and design. I noted that several of the GSD courses and events referenced the word resilience. In spring 2020, 13 courses included that word, or resilient or resiliency, in their descriptions, and 3 courses use one of those words in its title. This isn't unique to the GSD, of course. Resilience is a benchmark of the design and building industry. Today's leading voices in architecture emphasize planning for climate resiliency, whether extreme heat or catastrophic flooding. They champion creating more resilient cities, neighborhoods, and communities. If, like me, you are interested in how the design of our built environment has perpetrated and perpetuated racial inequities, then calls for resilience may cause you to question what the word means and what it requires. So I want you to stop for a moment and write into the chat or think to yourself what the word resilient means to you. When I hear resilient, I recall the comments of a newscaster I interviewed for some content at the museum prior to opening. When asked to complete the sentence, African American history and culture has taught me, she said, African American history and culture has taught me that, Black people are very resilient. I mean, we're a history of resilient people. And, at some point it's like, let's stop being resilient. I don't want to be like, oh, so resilient. I want to be like, and then they fought, and then the battle was won, and people could stop being resilient and just move on into victory. She ended with, I think that, resilience has been key in the history of Black people in this country. But the last words I really heard were, and then the battle was won. The people could stop being resilient and just move on into victory. For me, that was a beautiful sentiment. Considering that resilience has been our history, as she said, as we know, does resilience have to define our future, Black people's futures? What does a future look like in which Black people can live in victory, not struggle, not resistance? Victory can be loud, like the roar of a crowd in a stadium, but it can also be the quiet victory of not having to care about a damn thing. Like not having to care about driving while Black, renting an Airbnb while Black, jogging while Black, resting while Black, trying to live while Black. In this future, Black people could just be. The battle over whether their lives are of value will have been won. And we will all know what Black people already know: we matter. As Alicia Garza said, and as the museum panel that quotes her reads, our lives matter. So that interview has stayed with me all of these years, though I have never written or spoken about it publicly. Sometimes I wince, sometimes I smile, often I sigh or smirk when resilience pops up in a headline. Gosh, do I have to be like, oh, so resilient again? It's been an interesting journey for me, having this quizzical thinking about resilience in the back of my head while hearing presentations and reading articles about resilient futures. According to an article published in Architect, the Journal of American Institute of Architects, resilience in its scientific definition is the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape after suffering a trauma. And in Understanding Resilience, a resource tool from the AIA, resilience is the ability of a system and its component parts to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from the effects of a hazardous event in a timely and efficient manner, including through ensuring the preservation, restoration, or improvement of its essential basic structures and functions. I like that definition. It covers what happens before, during, and after the hazardous or traumatic event. In noting that recovery is coexistent with ensuring the preservation of the essential aspects of the thing impacted, this description of resilience as applied to architecture suggests that despite attempts at its destruction, the thing impacted is equipped with the assets needed to self-preserve. Lucille Clifton has a poem about something like that. Won't you celebrate with me? Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come, celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. We might say that the speaker in Clifton's poem has been resilient. She has withstood the assaults and attempts at her eradication. She has ensured the preservation of her life, another birthday reached. But do we really know how resilient she was, in fact? Is not dying enough? That is, what is the quality of life of being always in struggle for self-preservation. I think about a well-respected architecture professor, a dean in fact, that recently left a new post. Reading articles about her resignation, her words were like a balm on Black women's souls. And here I'm going to share some excerpts about her decision to leave. She said, "I was not able to build enough support to be able to deliver either on my promise of change or my vision for it. The lack of meaningful support, not lip service, of which there is always surfeit, meant my workload was absolutely crippling. No job is worth one's life, and at times I genuinely feared for my own. Race is never far from the surface of any situation in the US. I lack the tools to both process and deflect it. That lack of respect, the lack and respect of empathy for Black people, especially Black women, caught me off guard. And I suppose I'd say in the end, my resignation was a profound act of self-preservation." Self-preservation. Decades ago, Audre Lorde, another Black woman, also a poet, told us, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." Like Clifton, who endured year after year, Lorde knew that self-preservation is a necessary response to the attempts to kill your spirit, if not crush your life. The Black woman dean's words were clear to me. Being a Black woman means you understand there is an expectation for you to perform in a particular way. And when you do not, your value is questioned. What type of performance am I talking about? The Black pillar. A pillar is something that upholds something else. Its purpose is to be in support of. A pillar is structural form and design system in service of another entity. Black women are used to being pillars, pillars of the family, pillars in their communities, in their departments, in their organization. Pillars that support, uplift, enable, and reinforce the things around them. Pillars don't require respect or empathy to do their work. They're designed for the work they do. Too many times, I have seen the Black woman pillar, the strong Black woman who nurtures but does not need, who extends herself but must never expect. She is a provider of a service, but if she decides, if she has a choice to not perform in this way, or if she doesn't have the tools to do so, who bridges the gap? Not surprisingly, in a follow-up article, the dean summed it up to a reporter this way, quote, "There is a deeply embedded idea in America of the figure of the caring Black female who will simply pick up all the work," she said. The reporter continues, "After the murder of George Floyd," she says, "she was immediately expected to advise on the school's public statements, on top of demands to, quote, speak, provide leadership, comfort, and sustenance. Having also contracted COVID-19, the workload became too much for her to bear." So that caring Black female who will pick up all of the work is a pillar, a Black pillar. I don't know all the details of the situation recounted, but I do know the dimensions of the experience. It is well documented amongst Black women scholars and those who write about Black women's experiences. Various books and articles have outlined the archetypes, tropes, controlling images, or other terms that have been employed to discuss the perceptions of Black women, perceptions that limit their or our ability to just exist. Resilience doesn't mean getting to live in victory of a battle won. To stay alive, we have to combat the things that try to kill us: overwork, poor health, invisibility, and the perception that our strength and resilience will save us. So you don't have to worry about us. We got this. Strong Black women, superwomen, race women, sturdy Black bridges, this bridge called my back, magical Negroes, Black girl magic. But as Jesse Williams had told us, just because we're magic doesn't mean we're not real. Here is an image of Black women doing nothing unexpected. The Black pillar supports and uplifts. That tradition of uplift is a legacy of early race women. The motto, lifting as we climb, from the National Association of Colored Women, exemplified those goals. Like caryatids that withstand the elements, the experience of Black women vis-a-vis resilience is one of unquestioned expectation. Yet, what if instead of hazardous events making us more resilient, they make us weaker, unstable, but still alive? Will someone be celebrating that? Weathering. To weather is another term used in various discourses to describe how structures withstand harsh circumstances. For example, Metropolis magazine advises, we know that we can't design for every unpredictable event, but we can make sure our buildings and cities are better able to weather these disruptions. That use of weathering, like resilience, also applies to people. But during my Loeb year, a different use of the term weathering caught my attention. In this version of weathering, public health researchers note how stress from persistent racism affected health outcomes for Black people. Premature aging and, quote, disproportionately high death rates from chronic conditions such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and most cancers, end quote, were recorded impacts. For Arlene T. Geronimus, who proposed the term weathering in the 1990s in relation to studies on Black women, the idea was to capture the positive connotation of weathering, that is, making it through a difficult experience, along with the negative implication, being damaged in the process, as cited by Patia Braithwaite in Self magazine. That's an important point. Weathering implies damage, collateral damage. In conversations about resilience in architecture, there is an implication of sustaining a hazardous event, but recovering. The damage, if any, is not permanent or irreparable. Perhaps humans are like that, but how much damage can one sustain? That is a question I've been grappling with all year. In 2020, a year when the need for people in cities to embrace resilience, I was confronted with what the limits of resilience are. As a Black woman professional, managing the crisis of the coronavirus pandemic and the trauma of police killings of unarmed Black women and men, much of it on video, broadcast on the daily news with disclaimers about disturbing images and decisions about no indictments, I am constantly processing incompatible information and expect it to rebound, to return to form. Which form exactly is unclear. Weathering contends there is both physical and mental health costs to chronic stress of racism. We experience it in our bodies, whether it happens to us or whether we consume it over dinner. And for Black women, the coping mechanisms we have employed to protect ourselves, manage perceptions, and remain professional, or whatever word you would like to substitute there, these extra efforts further damage our health. So what happens when resilience is over? Is endless weathering what is left? How are resilience and weathering related when talking about Black people and Black people sustaining damage? How much could Black people be expected to bounce back from? COVID-19 disproportionately affecting Blacks and Latinos in the United States, turning some of the most at-risk populations into essential workers, stratifying people by their underlying health conditions, which for African Americans meant the fatal recognition that because of systemic racism, poverty, and a discounting, maybe even disbelief of Black pain, they are living with comorbidities and thus dying of COVID at a faster pace. People who had been resilient successful or resilient struggling were now dying in droves, and there seemed to be nothing they could do to preserve their lives. But the circumstances that created their comorbidities, the weathering of racism and social inequity, the precarious resilience of holding down a now essential service industry job, the living in densely populated, environmentally suspect spaces that verged on overcrowding. These things are embedded in systemic issues and could be attacked. The resulting disparities were a function of design. They could be undesigned. The work of collectives like Design as Protest is doing that work, organizing, educating, and working to dismantle oppressive systems at the core, as is Dark Matter University, the Black Reconstruction Collective, and many which I don't know yet. I took courage from the voices of Black women who were engaging in these questions in public. Jay Pitter's work, which I recommend everyone read on different densities, particularly forgotten densities, helped me think through my questions about whether wealthy people in New York City's high-rise luxury condos were as doomed, or another word, as the inhabitants of similarly scaled public housing. Likewise, I appreciated Brandy Summers' New York Times essay titled "What Black America Knows About Quarantine," which explains that for Black Americans, being quarantined is part of a longer legacy of Black movement being constricted and surveilled. These historically focused readings of contemporary spatial dilemmas through the lenses of class and race were instructive. Like these voices, we need more critical thinking that challenges how we talk, see, and sense disparity. How can design eliminate death by disparity across gender, race, and class? What happens if we put Black women at the center of our analyses? What can architecture do to make sure we're gonna be all right? What can I do? The intervention I wanted to make today is to trigger our critical thinking about race and architecture through recalibrating our language. Do you think about Black women when you hear these words? Resilience, weathering, pillars. When we use terms we associate with architecture and with people, let us think about those whose bodies are implicated, on the line, and vulnerable, always and especially in times of crisis. Who is expected to serve a supporting role? Who must function as a bridge? Who is designed to be resilient and who isn't? Who uplifts? Who carries? And who cares? I'm gonna end with a personal note. In March, I sheltered in place in Long Island with my family. The situation that was playing out in my family's home was revealing. My 80-something-year-old mother was taking care of her 80-something-year-old sister to the best of her ability, aided by part-time female caregivers and me. 4 women trying to hold up one another, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes in spurts. Strong Black women? Perhaps. Magical? Maybe. Resilient? It depends. Our caregivers, all immigrants, Black or South Asian women, were still taking public transportation to and from work at the height of the New York pandemic. Occasionally, they might get a ride from a husband or a sister or a taxi. Daily, we watched the death tolls together on TV as we ate our late breakfast. We talked about our home remedies of ginger, turmeric, lemon, cayenne, and other variations. Our goal, keep our immune systems up. Try to create an unwelcome environment for the virus. Resist infection, don't succumb. We were not always successful. In these moments, I thought about our vulnerabilities more than our resilience. What would tip the scale? Was resilience something we could depend on? And I thought about Sandra Bland, a Black woman who died tragically in a Texas jail in 2015, a few days after being pulled over for lacking to signal a lane change. There are full tapes of Bland being stopped and arrested and jailed. But we also have Bland's own videos of inspirational speeches and uplifting messages, many recorded in her car and shared on Facebook. She even had a Sandy Speaks video series, providing social media race woman-like analyses for the Black Lives Matter era. Poet Lillian Green wrote an assessment of the traffic stop titled, "Stay in Your Lane." It tracks the dangers of being a Black woman, being perceived one way, expected to perform another way, and the casualties of not being complicit in your own degradation. So with that, my final offering for this talk, I will share excerpts from the poem about Sandra Bland, which to me is also about equity and the built environment. Stay in Your Lane by Lillian Green. Before he stops you, he follows your car to watch you. You change lanes in order for him to pass you by. Instead, he stops your car. You don't know why. License and registration, he can sense your aggravation. There is something about your tone. You speak with an air he does not condone. You're a woman and you're Black. Do not speak, do not talk back. He wears a uniform, he wears a badge. He will taser you, do not make him mad. Sounds of struggle can be heard, and of course there are the words. His backup is on the way, you're on the ground, in handcuffs you'll stay. 3 days in jail, and you tragically die. Of course, it would not have happened if he passed you by. But he had to stop you. To make it plain. He is in charge. Stay in your lane. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. We have a few questions. There's of course, this is an opportunity for people to ask a few more. I have one from you specifically as an African-American woman who I'm like the anti-caping, anti-mule woman. I'm curious about how you think Black men, but honestly, it could just be all men. I do want to hear your specific comments about Black men, how they can be allies, I guess, in this tearing down of the myth of Black woman resiliency and our superpowers that we have to do everything.
How can Black men be allies in that? I think by really being realistic, as we all should be, and understanding, what is possible for any human. And so resiliency is not something that is specific, of course, to Black women. It's, part of the human spirit. It's what we said before, an American value. And it's something that's also gets identified with children a lot, that children are very resilient. And so I think, there's a lot of pride to be taken in being able to, in the fact that African Americans have cultivated that as a characteristic that they value, and they have been able to withstand so much because they've cultivated resiliency. But I think we also have to get to a point where we look at the structural aspects, and instead of expecting resilience, start to understand what can we do to be more protective, to be more comforting, to break away from the things that we are being attacked with. And so, I would say for Black men, then they have to figure out what that is for themselves, that they have to figure out, are there things that I'm doing that are contributing to perceiving women this way?
I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for your presentation. We have a question from Stacy Morgan. Could you discuss the significance to you of the Allison Starr artwork still featured in your presentation?
Sure. I'm glad that I got a question about the artwork. When I wrote the description for this talk, I said that I'd be drawing on African American literature and visual art. And so unfortunately, because it's a talk and not a longer sort of thesis about ideas and images, a lot of the illustrations and artwork are there to help us think. And as I was going through, basically going through my phone camera the other day, I came across some images that I had taken, and I said, wow, these images speak to me in this moment about exactly what I'm writing about, particularly the first set of images with the figures with the really kind of wiry legs. And so I haven't gone back to look at Allison's own reading of those sculptures, but I felt very connected, and I thought it would be provocative enough for me to share with you, and hopefully to have you all, for those of you who are interested, to look up some of the artists that I was able to share this evening.
Well, one question I really wanted to ask someone who had expertise in this is the images that we see in the media, I guess, that are kind of upheld as heroism, and I just want your thoughts on it. Women on the front lines at the protest. I totally, not in a disagreement at all with the ideas, obviously, but I guess that sense of being right there in harm's way, right up in front of police officers. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts on what that kind of communicates or says about Black women and our resilience.
I mean, I think we've always been there. Just even thinking about the race woman, one of the characteristics is that, so this was someone who was known in public, right? So to be sort of classified as a race woman, you were making speeches, you were known as a champion of the race, you were almost in a protective and defensive mode towards, the people who looked like you. And so to see women on the front lines, I think it is part of a longer tradition that we've seen. And we know, the founders of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives Matter, 3 Black women. So I think we've continued that tradition. But it takes all of us to, be honest, we need all of us out there. And doing the work that we all do. Everybody isn't on the front lines. And I'm not someone that's always on the front lines, but I feel like the work that I'm privileged to be able to do at the museum is a way of making sure the people who are on the front lines, that their stories get told.
I think that partially answers this next question, something I'm curious about as well, from Carter Brooks. Being a Black man and having seen and understood the disparities of Black people in a white America, do you believe that a cultural change via design will come around anytime soon?
I do think it's possible. I would say I'm still new to design as a field. It's not something that I was studying when I was an undergrad, or it's something that I came to really think about how it's embedded in so many of our systems, not just our spatial systems, but just our systems, everything is designed. And so some of the most exciting work that I've been seeing has been through, collectives like Design as Protest that I just mentioned. I've participated in some of their national calls, and it is a space that is sort of a Black, Indigenous, people of color space, but it also has space for allies. And the kind of vibrancy that I see with some of those members, it does give me a lot of hope. Even when I was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard, and a lot of the open letters and things that have come out since the killing of George Floyd, and since some of the more institutional statements of solidarity, I think we're at that tipping point. People have used the word reckoning, and I do believe in my lifetime this is the closest to reckoning that I've seen in the U.S. And I do think design right now is well positioned to break open some of that change, because the way you're trained to think is the way that people need to be thinking about dismantling. If you're trained to put something together, you also understand how to take it apart.
Nate Cole had a question. You referenced literature heavily. Can you speak more on that significance in the realm of personal education and how this expands what architecture can be influenced by?
Yeah, I love that. When I was probably 8 or 9, I thought I was going to be a poet, and I would go to the library and read all of the, Black poets that I could find and other Black authors. And my first area of focus as a scholar was literature. And secondly, I became interested in visual art. And so you see both of those things in the presentation. That's why I said I consider myself relatively new to design, because I've gone through I taught literature for a couple of years at Bard College. And poetry is just one of those places I go in a time of crisis. When today I was looking at what was going on with the truck being trailed by the people with the guns. And I was like, I have to shut off this news, come back to my paper. And if I didn't have to do this paper, I'd probably be reading some poetry, because those creative minds are the ones that get us through hard times. Dancing is also good for getting us through hard times. So I think we always have to find ways to, one, as I said, preserve ourselves, preserve our communities, be in community. And often for me, it's the arts, it's reading, it's literature, it's going to the museum. Yesterday, I popped into a museum down the street from my house to just have those moments of reflection and engagement, and for my spirit to be replenished, because that is what is happening. There is an assault on our spirit. And even as resilient as we have been trained to be, we have to continue to protect ourselves from being completely sort of eradicated.
And this is a good one. From Melissa Fisher, there's a great amount of discussion about the future of work in the workplace. Can you speak about how your critical race approach can help us think about the future of race, equity, and workplace design?
I'm not sure. Can you repeat that?
Let me re-find it. All right. There's a great amount of discussion about the future of work in the workplace. Can you speak about how your critical race approach can help us think about the future of race, equity, and workplace design?
Well, I can't speak about it, but what I will say is that kind of going back to even the example of Design as Protest, being on one of the calls with them, we started with the land acknowledgement, as you all did start with that as well here. There was a music break somewhere in between. When I've gone to the Black in Design conference, they've had breaks for yoga and dancing. And so I like I said, going back to how people think about putting things together in systems, we have to bring that same type of thinking to everything. And so for workplace design, what do people who work need? They also need rest, right? What do people who are being stressed out from, systemic racism need? They might need, safe spaces to divulge those experiences or to deal with trauma. And so I don't have an answer from a design perspective, but what I think is important is that in having conversations like this and bring those issues to the fore, as any issue a designer has to deal with, then design has to confront and meet those challenges. And so workplace design becomes another thing to figure out in this big scheme of how do we attack issues of equity and injustice and people who are suffering and dealing with that.
I wanted to hear some of your thoughts on, this is an interest of mine, so I really want to hear from you on prison design, and how you think racism could possibly be expressed in prison design, detention facilities in general.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are already some folks working on this, right? There are some collaboratives that are looking, or even, folks who have bonded together and say, we will not support the, architectural design for any new buildings, any new prison complexes. On the other side, you have folks like Deanna Van Buren talking about restorative justice, and instead of kind of the prison industrial complex, looking at how we design spaces that have to do with kind of restorative justice and making sure that people heal. So I almost like the question with work, I think you can probably fill any blank in and think about solutions that you have to start thinking about who's impacted, like I said, who's vulnerable, who's supposed to be resilient, start questioning the things that we're led to believe and start thinking how to challenge the systems, because the systems that we're in clearly are not serving, for the most part, they're not serving Black and brown people. And even with this idea of being able to like bounce back to normal, one of my colleagues said, what does that look like? Like that normal was never a healthy space for us. And so we're not really invested in that either. And getting back to something that was not, that was traumatic. It was just like an earlier trauma as opposed to the later trauma.
Here's another good one. The notion of resilience is something I'm proud my people can be characterized by, but being resilient is an effective defense to the world around us. Is there an effective offense that the Black community can utilize to solidify our place in the world?
That's a beautiful question. The word that comes to mind is creativity. But I would love to sit with that some more. And if people that are on the line have answers to that, I'd love to see that question in the chat and people try to think about other ways. Because these are all sorts of performances, but I guess what we're looking at are what performances are authentic to us that don't make us have to show up as something else to manage somebody else's response to us. And also understanding that the trajectory of that, had to do with racial terrorism. People weren't out there just trying to perform or to manage expectations, just, to be cool. People's bodies were on the line. And some of these coping strategies and tactics were protective measures.
Michelle, are you open for one or two more questions? Let's say
Yeah.
We've got a couple more coming in. Great, wonderful.
There's one, well, there's two really good ones here, but I can only do one at a time. How will people of color be able to discern when and how to speak up for themselves without putting themselves in danger? How will progress for social justice be identifiable through time? What will indicate this progress? So that's a big one to unpack.
Go with your gut. For the first part of that, I think it's go with your gut. I think we've all been in a meeting, we thought, oh, should I say something? Then, sometimes you can't fight every battle because you'll just be tired all the time. So, that's that balance, but going back to that issue of weathering, because of that balance and having to figure out when to speak up, when to let it go, when to demand, when to negotiate, that is all labor. That's all work. And all of that work impacts your health, right? And so I think the more that we can speak up, speak out, be clear about our needs and be realistic about expectations, the better our own well-being. So I would say prioritize your well-being and let that lead you in terms of, when to engage and when to disengage. I lost the other two parts of the question, but.
The second part was, how will progress for social justice be identifiable through time? What will indicate that progress?
Rest. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. When Black people feel well rested, when, we can't see disparity based on skin color or zip code. Yeah.
I think I have one more that'll be a good way to tie this discussion together and leave us something to think about. What do you think the future of the concept of whiteness is, and will it need to inherently change to aid in the progression of equity in the country and beyond, given the relationship of whiteness to the history of the world?
I'm not, it's not a question I'm really that interested in. I think what I'm most interested in is, to go back to the last question that I just answered, is, how will we feel when we get to a point where we wake up well rested, we walk down the street without fear, it's not scary to turn on the TV. Those are the things that I'm most interested in. And I do think about whiteness in the sense of, it's a topic of conversation in our readings now, but I think a lot of other people have to think about whiteness. Right now, I don't see my role as that. So I'm glad that there are more resources, and I'm glad that people are interrogating it, because it does need to be interrogated. But as you saw with my presentation, my focus is really like enriching my spirit and trying to dismantle the things, even through words, that I'm able to do, and to kind of present questions and provoke a field, the field of architecture and design, to, kind of open up the blinders a bit. And as we say, do some critical thinking about its own history and what its future should look like.
Thank you again. I appreciate your perspective in that presentation.
Thank you.
I'm so sad that we are coming to a close. There's so much more. This has been phenomenal, Michelle. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's been really wonderful and very, very challenging and enlightening. And I'm personally am walking away with this question that you posed about architects and designers being good at taking things apart, because they're good at putting things together. And actually, it's interesting because I'm thinking historically, maybe we haven't been that good at responsibly taking things apart. And maybe this is yet another reason why we need to get good at that. And I think that this talk is really wonderful in the sense that it helps us understand our relationship to structures, both the physical structures and the social structures, or the metaphorical structures. So thank you so much again for this presentation and this conversation.
Thank you. Power to the people. Good luck.
Thank you, and we'll say good night to you and wish you well. And until next time.
Thank you, Michelle.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.